They called him the Heartbreak Kid, but heartbreak doesn't begin to describe what followed. Imagine, if your meager imagination permits, a man whose charm could disarm cynicism itself, whose athletic grace painted masterpieces between the ropes, and yet, behind the curtain, lay a storm so ravenous it swallowed careers, friendships, even his own identity. Before the arenas filled with cheers, before the gold and the glass shattered, Shawn Michaels was merely a boy named Michael Hickenbottom, but something inside him always refused to stay ordinary. This is not the story of a wrestling icon. This is the story of a man at war with himself and with the world that dared to love him. He was just 12 when the first seeds of obsession took root. A military brat from San Antonio, hopping from base to base, Shawn sought permanence in the transience of wrestling broadcasts. While other boys dreamt of touchdowns or grades, Shawn fantasized about robes, music, blood, and adoration. He performed mock matches in swimming pools, dressed like Ric Flair, and tasted early triumph in a school talent show that featured chair shots and staged blood. His parents disapproved. Naturally. What parent wouldn't fear their son spiraling into a career built on ego and impact? But something in Shawn had already detached from the mundane world they offered. He didn't just want greatness, he demanded it. By 20, the descent began. His first spin on a slot machine yielded $750, a foolish fortune for a foolish youth. It was gone within hours, snorted into his bloodstream, cocaine marking the beginning of a spiral he would later call freedom. A better word might be possession. Unlike most addicts who stumble into substance, Shawn ran toward it like a lover. Wrestling trainer Jose Lothario took him under his wing, but after training sessions, Shawn's nights belonged to bars, powder, and self-annihilation. The intoxicating highs outside the ring mirrored the adrenaline inside it. Every win, every cheer only masked the deeper rot. The boy was becoming the Heartbreak Kid, not as a gimmick, but as a warning. He debuted professionally in 1984 and quickly caught eyes, not just for his moves, but for his attitude, brazen, unapologetic, incandescent. Alongside Marty Jannetty, he formed the Midnight Rockers, a team as chaotic backstage as they were exhilarating in the ring. They were wild, reckless, beloved, and entirely unsustainable. The WWF briefly signed them, then fired them 2 weeks later after a barroom brawl. Whether Shawn threw the first glass or not became irrelevant. Consequences, that strange and foreign language, still hadn't reached him. Marty descended into instability. Shawn evolved into something worse, invincibility. Depression came, but in disguise. Not as sorrow, but as a loaded gun held to his own head in a hotel room. He didn't pull the trigger. Why? Not because of hope, because of pride. That old parasite would not let him die unknown. Shawn clawed his way back to WWF with Marty, now known simply as the Rockers. Fans loved them. Management didn't. Their title win was erased. Politics eclipsed performance. That was Shawn's second awakening. Talent is good, power is better. And if he couldn't have both, he would burn down anyone who stood in his way. Marty was the first. In 1992, in a scripted act that mirrored real-life spite, Shawn shattered Marty through a glass window during a barbershop segment. The team was dead. So was any trace of loyalty. Shawn had seen the future, and it didn't have room for partners. Alone, he thrived. His charisma sharpened into a blade. He took on Sensational Sherry as his manager and entered his next phase, a heel so flamboyant, so arrogant, that the crowd couldn't look away. Inspired by Freddie Mercury and Elvis, his strut wasn't imitation, it was declaration. I am untouchable. And yet, his growing influence came at a cost. He surrounded himself with dangerous allies. His new bodyguard Diesel, his faction, the notorious Kliq, began twisting the WWE's backstage into a playground of manipulation. If Shawn didn't like you, you were buried. If he liked you, you were protected. Matches were changed, careers ruined. Dean Douglas, Vader, Jean-Pierre Lafitte. They fell, not because of the crowd's disdain, but because they dared to step into a game where Shawn was already cheating. Power wasn't enough. It had to be his. But then came his greatest threat, Bret Hart. Another alpha, another technician. Except Bret had something Shawn didn't: restraint. Bret was respected, Shawn was feared. Their rivalry became the black sun of wrestling's mid-90s era. It culminated not in the ring, but in what would become known as the Montreal Screwjob, a betrayal so severe it would tarnish legacies, break friendships, and leave fans questioning the very reality of wrestling. Bret was supposed to leave with dignity. Instead, Shawn took it from him in front of the world, a smirk on his face as Vince McMahon rang the bell early. Shawn denied involvement until he didn't. Years later, he confessed. He had lied, orchestrated, and deceived. He had made a mockery of trust. But at the time, he didn't care. He was the best, the main event, the icon, the showstopper. He wasn't going to lose to anyone, least of all someone who dared to act morally superior. What is morality to a man with godlike talent and no God? And yet, behind all the ego, behind the championships and the posed smiles, something had begun to fracture. It wasn't visible yet, not to the fans, not even to Shawn, but it was there, gnawing away like a wolf chewing through its own leg to escape a trap. The drugs were no longer celebratory, they were necessary. The charisma was now armor. And as 1998 approached, Shawn Michaels would face a moment that not even he could twist into victory. His back would break. His smile would disappear. And the man who ruled the wrestling world would be left alone, crushed not by an opponent, but by the weight of himself. He couldn't feel his legs, not completely. The pain that pulsed from his spine wasn't just physical, it was existential. In the casket match against The Undertaker in early 1998, Shawn Michaels took a bump that changed everything. Not just the trajectory of his career, but the architecture of his identity. The man who once defied pain, who grinned through concussions and danced through hangovers, now faced something he couldn't pin down or politic his way out of. A shattered back. The showstopper had been stopped, not by a rival, not by management, but by his own recklessness finally crashing down on him like divine judgment. And yet, not even a broken back would end his career. Not entirely. No, something darker had to finish the job first. Painkillers became ritual. Alcohol, the daily benediction. Shawn Michaels wasn't recovering. He was dissolving. He didn't wrestle. He haunted. Backstage, as commissioner, he was unpredictable and increasingly unrecognizable. The man who once demanded perfection from others could no longer find the strength to stand upright at the dinner table. In private, he'd fall asleep face down in his food. His wife, Nitro Girl Rebecca, tried to smile through the horror, pretending to their son that daddy was just tired. But children are not as blind as adults pretend. Their son saw, he understood, not fully, but enough. And that realization, not the broken spine, not the loss of fame, that finally brought Shawn Michaels to his knees. It was not a doctor, not a friend, not even Triple H, who by now had drifted away, ashamed and exhausted from watching his friend rot himself hollow. It was a child's voice. "Daddy's tired," he'd said, casually, sweetly, and that phrase echoed in Shawn's skull like a funeral bell. That wasn't just a comment, it was a prophecy. Shawn saw it, a future where his son would grow to despise him, not because he wasn't a good wrestler, but because he wasn't a man. That night, without ceremony or medical support, Shawn went cold turkey. No weaning, no second chances, just agony, withdrawal, rage, and eventually, silence. The silence was sacred. On Christmas Eve, Rebecca handed him a Bible, a gesture most of your kind would dismiss as sentimental. But to a man whose heart had been emptied, even sentiment can be salvation. And there, in the black ink of Scripture, Shawn Michaels didn't just find words, he found accountability. God didn't forgive him in an instant. He didn't erase the scars, but he listened. That alone broke something open in Shawn, the need to matter to something larger than ego. And so, the second Shawn Michaels was born, not from applause, but from repentance. He stayed away from the ring for 4 long years. In that time, he didn't chase fame. He didn't storm offices demanding main events. He taught. At his small academy in San Antonio, he trained young hopefuls, among them a then unknown Daniel Bryan. Gone was the arrogant showman barking orders. In his place stood a man offering wisdom, and shockingly, humility. Shawn knew he couldn't erase his past, but he could forge a better future through others. Not through manipulation, but mentorship. He was beginning to understand the price of his first life. And slowly, the industry began to believe in him again, not as a performer, but as a person. Then came 2002, SummerSlam. The whispers became a roar. Could Shawn Michaels return? Not for vanity, he claimed that part of him had died, but for closure. His friend Triple H, now a titan in the company, stood across from him. It wasn't just a match, it was a crucible. Could the reformed man step back into the very arena that had once fed every vice in his soul without losing himself? The bell rang, the crowd roared, and in the ring, something miraculous happened. The man who was once too broken to walk flew again, not with the recklessness of his youth, but with clarity, precision, purpose. The match was a masterpiece. He won. And unlike the old Shawn, who might have paraded and gloated, this one collapsed to his knees in gratitude. He didn't know if his body could survive another match. He didn't care. The demon had been exorcised, if only for a night, and the man had prevailed. The WWE fans were watching something they never thought they'd see, a redemption arc in real time. And yet, even redemption has its limits. Old habits don't die, they hibernate. In 2005, against Hulk Hogan at SummerSlam, the first cracks reappeared. A 3-match series had been promised. Hogan politicized it into one and insisted on winning. The old Shawn would have erupted, sabotaged, retaliated with backstage revenge. The new one, he sold the match, but he did so with mockery, overselling every move, flopping absurdly, turning the match into a pantomime of revenge. Passive aggression had replaced direct malice, a slight evolution, but evolution nonetheless. Even in Rebirth, Shawn's scars bled through the skin. But there were other moments, better ones, where he truly rose above. WrestleMania 23, where he made John Cena into a star. The match against Ric Flair, where his own childhood hero was given a send-off laced with poetry and pain. "I'm sorry, I love you." The words, whispered just before he delivered the final super kick, weren't just for Flair. They were for every opponent, every friend, every enemy he had betrayed. They were for himself. They were for the boy who watched Ric Flair in his living room, dreaming of rings and robes, long before the cocaine, the ego, the glass windows. And then came Bret Hart, the man he'd humiliated, lied to, and shattered. Time had frozen them in amber, symbols of an era defined by betrayal. But in 2010, with every camera watching, they met again. They shook hands. Bret forgave him, or said he did. That moment wasn't for the fans. It was for two men, both survivors of a war neither of them had won. For Shawn, it was the final step. He had found peace not only in faith and family, but in closure. But peace is not the absence of demons. It is merely the strength to hold them at bay. Shawn Michaels stood on the precipice of his second farewell. But deep in the shadows, something still stirred. One final act, one final choice that would threaten to unravel everything. He had done it. Somehow, the man who once held a gun to his own head, who danced on the grave of friendships, who manipulated entire locker rooms with a sneer, had carved out a second life. Not by force, but by grace. When Shawn Michaels retired at WrestleMania 26 in 2010, it wasn't with a bang, but with a whisper. Career versus streak. The match was a requiem. A solemn, beautiful surrender to something bigger than ego. He lost. He left. The world applauded. It should have ended there. And yet, what fool believes stories end where they should? For 8 years, he stayed away. Not from wrestling entirely. He mentored, advised, guided. The NXT locker room saw a different Shawn. Quiet, contemplative, even kind. Younger wrestlers would marvel at his insights, whispering to each other in awe that this was the same man who once torched careers in a haze of narcotics and narcissism. His second act had earned him something he never truly had in his first. Respect. Genuine, unflinching respect. And so, when whispers began in 2018 about one more match, fans didn't scoff. They begged. Could the legend lace the boots one last time? The answer came not in New York or Chicago or any hallowed hall of wrestling history. No, it came in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, at Crown Jewel 2018, a grotesque spectacle wrapped in blood money and political tension. WWE's decision to host a pay-per-view event in the kingdom sparked international outrage. Superstars like John Cena and Daniel Bryan refused to participate, but not Shawn. No, the man who once walked away at his peak now walked back. For $3 million, the Heartbreak Kid returned, and everything broke. It wasn't just that he was old. That would have been forgivable. It wasn't even that the match itself, featuring his longtime partner Triple H, and the crumbling remnants of Kane and The Undertaker, was a slow-motion car crash drenched in the embalming fluid of nostalgia. No, what shattered the illusion was the very thing Shawn had worked so hard to construct in his second life: dignity. He flailed, he missed spots, he stumbled through sequences. At one point, he stood alone in the ring, bald, gasping, vacant-eyed, and the audience realized with horror that they were watching not a return, but a betrayal of finality. Triple H tore his pectoral muscle, Kane lost his mask, The Undertaker looked like a ghost walking through wet cement. And Shawn? He tried. God, he tried. But something died in that ring that night. Not just the myth of his perfection, that had died long ago. What perished at Crown Jewel was the idea that redemption can be permanent. For 8 years, he had held firm, and for one match, one check, he had thrown it away. Backstage, he claimed it was just a fun tag match. But the footage doesn't lie, neither does the weight of regret. In interviews since, he dodges the question, but you can see it in his eyes. The same look he had when he first stepped away in 1998, broken, bitter, ashamed. The only difference now was that he had no excuse, no injury, no addiction, just choice. He chose to come back. And for a man who built his second life on not choosing the easy way out, that choice was damning. Yet still, even after that misstep, the legacy could not be undone. Shawn Michaels' story isn't about perfection. It's about war, the internal kind, the kind no championship can silence. Because beneath the sequins and song, beneath the accolades and redemption, he remains a man haunted by duality, artist and addict, hero and heretic, idol and invader. And this, perhaps, is what makes his story more human than most. He didn't conquer his demons. He made peace with them, tenuously, tremblingly, and sometimes they win. But look closely at what remains. In WWE's Performance Center, young wrestlers still line up to learn from him. Not because he was the best, though he was, but because he fell and rose and fell again and never lied about it. He speaks now not of titles or records, but of responsibility. He tells the young ones, "Don't do it my way. Learn from my wreckage." And they listen. Because when he speaks of pain, it is not performance, it is gospel. He found peace not because he changed completely, but because he stopped pretending he hadn't once been a monster. And that, in your grotesque little human world, is as close to heroism as any of you ever get. Marty Jannetty, Bret Hart, even Vince McMahon, all eventually came to some brittle understanding with the man who once torched everything in his path. The prodigal son didn't just return, he stayed. Not in the main event, but in the shadows. Watching, guiding, enduring. And so, the story of Shawn Michaels ends not with a roar, not even with a cheer, but with a question. A man, now bald and aged, once known for heartbreak, now a mentor to the future, sits alone some nights, perhaps still wondering, can redemption ever truly erase the sins that made us who we are?